2. Going home. I phoned my childhood friend Young Nam from Pyongyang Station. We had been close friends in nursery school, where we were in the same class, and had remained inseparable all the way to the end of primary school. "You're meeting me at the station, right?" "In your wildest dreams." His response was as predictable as ever, and I burst into laughter. Young Nam's nickname was Japo, short for Japanese expatriate. Like me, he had been born in Sarawon in North Korea, but all the kids called him Japo because his parents were immigrants from Osaka in Japan. They had arrived in Sarawon in the 1960s as part of the repatriation of Koreans from Japan, referred to as the Great Movement of the Korean People. At the time, in a bid to promote the North over the South as the homeland of a unified Korea, Kim Il-sung welcomed into North Korea around 100,000 ethnic Koreans who had been living in Japan. After the Korean War, the circumstances of the Cold War made North Korea a more attractive choice in terms of its economic superiority, and this enabled Kim Il-sung to pursue a policy of embracing expatriates. Using these immigrants as evidence of people choosing socialism over capitalism, the North Korean state fervently referred to them in propaganda campaigns. On the surface, it looked as if Kim Il-sung was gaining significantly from a propaganda policy based on an embracing celebration of Korean ethnicity. In reality, however, the arrival of the immigrants caused unexpected ripples in North Korean society. Actually, it was what they brought with them that had the greatest impact. The Japanese products that the immigrants brought with them were regarded as wondrous goods from the outside world, never before seen by ordinary North Koreans. Until then, they had believed that any product of Kim Il-sung's socialism must be the best in the world. But now they were exposed to the state of progress in Japan. The immigrants settled all over North Korea, according to their wishes or ancestral connections, and an unofficial new slogan was seized on nationwide. "Capitalism may be rotten to the core, but they do make good products." Almost instantaneously, North Korea became caught up in a fever of all things made in Japan. It became a fad for North Koreans to pick up labels or packaging thrown out by the Japos and display them in their homes like treasure. The immigrants naturally came to be regarded as a privileged class through their enjoyment of Japanese products, and they were soon firmly entrenched in the comfortable middle class of North Korean society. They were admired not only because of the products they possessed, but also because of their Japanese cultural traits. Whether it was their characteristic forms of greeting, language, manners, or even their eating habits, their way of life was considered sophisticated and prosperous. In contrast, the official reward of higher status in return for loyal service seemed not as exciting. Increasingly, those who did not have family outside the country to send in Japanese products tried to emulate the Japos, at least in cultural terms. Children were all too sensitive to this trend, complaining to their parents that none of their older relatives had had the foresight to run away and settle in Japan. The North Korean state had built the legitimacy of Kim Il-sung on the basis of his credentials as an anti-Japanese resistance fighter, and so it was a great irony that his immigration movement caused ordinary North Koreans to admire Japan. Korea had been freed from the ignominy of colonial servitude under the Japanese, but now it had been colonized again by the Japanese, or, more specifically, the Jochongron, the organization run by the UFD that represents people of Korean origin in Japan. In effect, the Japan taboo, reinforced by means of institutional communalism, had begun to fade away from the public consciousness. To North Koreans, for whom even ordinary clothes were a uniform dictated by the state, the notion of a private car for individual use was inconceivable. Nevertheless, this very privilege was freely given to the Japos, whose private cars, speeding along empty roads in Pyongyang, were more than just a mode of transport in the eyes of North Koreans. They introduced the dangerous suggestion that one might control the speed of one's journey, instead of goose-stepping in line to the whistle of the state. In this way, the presence of these immigrants offered a daring invitation to flout the traditional framework of loyalty. The North Korean state's jealousy eventually led to oppression of the Japos. The immigrants, who had experience and memories of living in a capitalist society, were assigned to the wavering class, reserved for those whose ideas were perceived to be a risk to the state. Their career prospects were severely restricted. Kim Jong-il even legally prohibited Japos from driving white cars. The reason for this seemed petty. It was because white cars were the same color as the background of Japan's national flag. In party lectures, cadres alleged that Japan only exported white cars to the world, yet within their own nation they were fixated on red cars. And the reason for this was that they wanted to paint their national flag on the world map as a symbol of their central position in the world. It was clearly a warning from above that a Japo could not be trusted in the same way as a Korean. Despite these efforts, the preference of many North Koreans for the Mount Fuji people, as opposed to the Mount Paektu people, and the anti-Japanese feats of Kim Il-sung, did not disappear. My friend Young Nam was therefore a member of a group of people who were generally admired, in contradiction to the official stance. Moreover, his family was once the wealthiest in Sarawon. Nevertheless, life became very difficult for his family after the death of his grandparents in Japan, when their supply of Japanese money and goods came to an end. As they were immigrants from Japan, Young Nam and his parents had no prospect of entering respectable careers, because the assignment of jobs was controlled by the Workers' Party. They had to start selling off their possessions one by one, and eventually they became impoverished and lived in a much worse state than the local North Koreans. The one thing I remember clearly from my childhood is that we had a Yamaha piano at home, given to our family by Young Nam's father when he was still a wealthy man. I remember my mother telling me that when Young Nam's family first settled in Sarawon, my father helped them secure a new apartment through the allocations made by the Workers' Party. As the piano had arrived in the house before I was born, I grew up assuming that everyone had Japanese pianos, just as everyone had a portrait of Kim Il-sung on their wall at home. One day, however, when I went to a friend's house to play, I realized that they did not have a piano. I was astonished. When I came home, I ran into the house and shouted at my mother, as if I had just witnessed something incredible. "Mom, did you know? They don't have a piano at home." She replied coolly, "They probably didn't want a piano in the house. They prefer reading books." It was only when I began my first year at Dongri People's Primary School that I came to understand that the possession of a Japanese Yamaha piano was a very big deal indeed. The kids, and the grown-ups too, referred to me as the boy with the Japanese piano, or the doctor's boy. Most kids at school lived in harmonica apartments built in the 1950s, so called because each floor had flats that were packed closely together, like the square holes in a harmonica. We lived in a large flat on the third floor of an apartment block set aside for officials. My mother, who was the head doctor at a medical center for the exclusive use of party cadres, hoped that my two older sisters would become teachers, and that I would one day become a famous pianist. She finally cajoled my father into finding me a famous piano tutor. One day, my father brought a tutor home with him. The man had a long face and spoke with the heavy accent characteristic of Hamgyong province in the north. But what amazed me more than his accent was that he was an ethnic Korean from China, and he stank of cigarette smoke, which I didn't like. Worse, he was a chain smoker, and my sisters didn't like him much at first either. But he didn't seem to care. Bending down, he pulled my ear to his mouth and said emphatically in his phlegmatic voice, "My name is Choi Liang. Do you hear that? 2 syllables. Choi Liang." His loud voice frightened me as much as the stench of smoke did. When my father announced that the man and his family were going to move in with us, I was devastated. I pretended to need the toilet, ran outside, and sobbed. Choi Liang became my first proper mentor. He had been a violinist in China's Shanghai Symphony Orchestra. During the Cultural Revolution, he'd fled the Red Guard's assaults on the educated by coming to North Korea, along with many other ethnic Koreans. His first job in North Korea was as a violin tutor at Pyongyang Art School. At the time, he and Paek Go-sun were considered to be among North Korea's leading violinists. Paek Go-sun had taken both the top prize for his category and the honorary prize in the Tchaikovsky International Music Competition of 1982. In 1978, he had also been the first Asian to be appointed a lifetime member of the panel of judges for the violin section of the competition. Pek Go-san had a younger brother called Pek Do-san, who had insulted Choi Liang by referring to him as a dirty bastard, a common derogatory term used by Koreans to refer to the Chinese. Choi Liang, infamous for his short temper, punched him in the face. For this, Choi Liang was banished to the countryside until my father rescued him from rustic exile by hiring him to teach me music. Choi Liang's wife, son, and daughter moved into our house with him, and our quiet home burst into unaccustomed life as it became home to our two families. In my early years, teacher Choi Liang seemed to me the cruelest of men. He started me off with ear training, and he went about this task without mercy. Several hundred times a day, I would have to strain to discern the note or interval he sounded on the piano. Gradually, I learned to pick out the notes and intervals without hesitation. Eventually, he moved on to chords, and by the end he had taught me how to arrange music for a string quartet. My father tried very hard to get Choi Liang hired as a professor at Sarawon Art School. However, his foreign birth proved too great an obstacle for the post, and he was taken on as a lecturer instead. Even so, because he was one of North Korea's leading violinists, students flocked from all over the country to study with him. Choi Liang frequently invited them to our house, and even showed them my string quartet arrangements. I still remember very clearly what Choi Liang had to say about string quartet arrangements, as he often repeated this piece of wisdom. Above all, the score should be covered with black notes everywhere. Semitone intervals should be used with care, but as frequently as needed. Understood? More than just an education in music, Choi Liang instilled in me great artistic ambition. Every day I listened to his anecdotes about Beethoven, Mozart, and the fame that surrounded them even after their deaths. While other children aspired to become party cadres, or to drive cars for party cadres, I dreamed of becoming Dvorak, and of achieving world renown for the composition of my own New World Symphony. I once mentioned this dream to my mother, and she gave me a fierce telling off, saying that if I shared these thoughts with anyone else, our entire family would be accused of revisionism or moral corruption. She made sure to give me a terrific fright by saying that if I didn't keep these thoughts to myself, I might be arrested. My mother was troubled by the realization that her 13-year-old son had grown enamored of the music of Dvorak. I had come to love his works because of the tape recordings that Choi Liang had smuggled in with him from China, and because the only other kind of music I had access to was the stuff I heard at school. It wasn't just that the music was limited to revolutionary anthems. Rather, after having been exposed to the thrilling world of harmonic possibility, I found it frustrating to listen to North Korean songs of perfect victory that did not allow for any suggestion of imperfection through musical dissonance or tension. Once, in singing class at school, I couldn't contain my thoughts any longer. I volunteered to do the accompaniment for the session, and played as I wished instead of following the prescribed pattern. My pedaling on the organ, there was no piano at school, wasn't perfect, but I knew that I had played well and without mistakes. In spite of this, our music teacher punished me for my deviation by humiliating me in front of the class, making an example of me as someone who knew nothing whatsoever about music. In my heart, though, I believed it was the school, not me, that lacked an understanding of music. As a result, I could not stop myself from beginning to doubt everything else the school taught us to regard as the most accurate and objective form of knowledge, whether this took the form of the revolutionary history of Kim Il-sung, linguistics, or any other subject. As time went on, I was confirmed in my conviction that Western music was artistically superior to the North Korean music I was being taught. It wasn't that I preferred one set of stylistic rules to the other. Western music had its rules too. But what it had that North Korean music didn't was the infinite possibilities of breaking an established rule, to make a new one of your own. With Choi Liang by my side to explain the intricacies of musical rule-breaking, I grew more confident that the transgression of expectation and rules was not unmusical, but rather that this was part of the essence of musicality. From dawn to dusk, I listened to Dvorak. My father worried about my hearing and took my headphones away from me several times, but I was so desperate that I once took a stethoscope from my mother's bag and held it against the speaker of the tape player so that I could listen under the blankets at night. My father was proudly supportive of my ambitions and was convinced that I was destined for great things, but Choi Liang was stubborn in his honesty. "This boy will never become a good pianist," he said. "His fingers are too short. He does have creative talent, though, and I recommend that he should train to be a composer." I entered Pyongyang Art School at 15. I was determined to become a world-famous composer, fulfilling the dream that Choi Liang had sown in me. But my sudden encounter with a book from the 100-copy collection resulted in my musical ambitions being replaced overnight by literary ones. The book was the collected works of Lord Byron. As part of North Korea's 100-copy collection, the print run of this book was restricted to 100 copies. In North Korea, the circulation of foreign books is restricted in this way, so that only the ruling Kim and his family, his closest associates, and select members of North Korea's elite have access to them. Each of the books in a 100-copy set has a stamped number on the first page to show which of the 100 copies it is. Books bearing the number 1 stamp are, of course, offered only to the ruling Kim. It is thus considered a mark of high status among cadres and other members of the elite to possess a book stamped with a single-digit numeral, or the closest number they can get to it. The secret translation and printing of these limited editions of foreign works continues to be done by a team of translators, working under the auspices of the Propaganda and Agitation Department and the Chosun Social Sciences Institute in the Jung-gu area of Pyongyang. It is the responsibility of cultural or science attachés stationed in DPRK embassies abroad to acquire foreign books for limited distribution through the system. I don't know how our copy of the collected works of Lord Byron had ended up in my father's personal bookcase. One day, I picked it up from the shelf out of mere curiosity, noticing that the spine of the book was different from the others stacked there. North Korean books usually reflect North Korean state aesthetics in their bright and gaudy designs. This book, however, was subdued in color. The dark and faded cover was suggestive of an ancient foreign culture. The pattern of a frame, similar in design to that of an oil painting, surrounded the printed title. Ordinary books were mass-produced, but this book seemed to be handmade, as its thick and bulky cover housed pages that were held together by delicate threadwork. I opened the book with vague curiosity, but I was pulled in from the first page, and the poetry seized me at once. The vocabulary was bold, and the words pushed their definitions and associations to the limits, unlike anything I had ever read. In North Korea, the institutional control of thought begins with the consolidation of language, a policy designed to unify the private and public spheres of thought. In order for the realms of individual expression to adhere to a shared ideology, the party's Propaganda and Agitation Department sets strict boundaries for the written and spoken word. No North Korean literary work may deviate from the legal framework of Kim Jong-il's Juche art theory, printed in several volumes, which sets the conditions under which socialist art can exist. The authority of thought which monitors and enforces this theory, through the penalty of prison camp for all those who are responsible for letting a deviant work slip through the net, is the National Literary Deliberation Committee. As one who had been brought up in such a fixed framework of linguistic expression, Byron's poetry was like a dictionary of New Korean to me. As I worked out the meanings and inferences in words I had never seen before, I experienced the strange sensation of learning how to speak Korean from a foreign language speaker. What really intrigued me too was the politeness of the language. In the North Korean language, there are 2 distinct registers of speech, one relating to the leader and one to everyone else. Before encountering Byron's poetry, I had thought that adjectives such as dear and respected were a special form of pronoun in the Korean language reserved for Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, along with great, which is always seen in one of the terms referring to Kim Il-sung as great leader. I had assumed these adjectives were names, just like Kim, and therefore etymologically and purely Korean. But I learned, through Byron's poetry, that these words were terms of respect that were part of a universal language and not uniquely Korean. I felt strangely elated by the discovery that these terms might be applied to an individual. Most of all, the patterns of words and poetic devices, all balanced against the underlying rhythm of the poem, awakened in me a sense of literary sublimity that surpassed what music alone could convey. Just as I had done with Dvorak's New World Symphony, I read Byron's epic poems, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage and The Corsair, over and over again in their North Korean translations. The Corsair's ending, the protagonist, a vagabond pirate, disappearing from the island upon learning of his beloved's death, left me restless, and this agitation lingered with me long after each reading. I had known only loyalty to the supreme leader, believing that this was the most sublime emotion a human being could feel. But these poems were proof that emotions could be experienced in a personal sphere that did not include the leader. This understanding may be taken for granted in the rest of the world, but it was an astounding epiphany for me, and after this realization, I wanted suddenly to confess my love to a woman. I wanted to fall in love, and I wanted to be weak for love. Out of this longing, I began to write poetry of my own. I even considered dropping out of Pyongyang Art School, but I did not dare let my parents down after the faith they had placed in me. The least I could do, though, was to attempt to find a literary mentor. There are 3 poems that all North Koreans must learn by heart. These are For My One and Only Homeland by Ri Su-bok, Mother by Kim Chul, and My Homeland by Kim Sang-oh. In For My One and Only Homeland, the poet states that although he has only one lifetime to live, he will sacrifice it to his homeland, of which there is also only one. In this poem, the self is sublimated to the country. Mother describes how the motherly love of the Workers' Party is deeper than that of any human mother, who cannot rear her child as an individual separate from the state. Here, motherly love is inadequate on its own, and profoundly inferior to the love provided by the party. My Homeland describes the great leader as the poet's true homeland, and the country is subsumed into the identity of its leader. If I were to have a teacher at all, I wanted it to be one of North Korea's foremost poets. Fortunately, as wide as my world seemed, it was also small. Ri Su-ryeon, the granddaughter of Kim Sang-oh, happened to be my classmate. When she told me that her grandfather had agreed to meet me, and she asked me to go home with her after lectures, I was so overjoyed that I took her hand and shook it wildly. It was the winter of 1990, when I should have been wholly devoted to my musical studies at Pyongyang Art School. Kim Sang-oh's apartment was in Otandong, in the Jung-gu area, with unobstructed views of the Daedong River. After Korea's liberation from Japanese occupation in 1948, Kim Sang-oh had returned from Japan and served as the deputy editor of a newspaper in Hwanghae Province. When Kim Il-sung came to Hwanghae Province, Kim Sang-oh was assigned to be his speechwriter. This collaboration eventually led to his promotion to the post of Vice President of the Central Committee of the Korean Writers' Union. However, the influence of China's Cultural Revolution, which began in 1966, led to many intellectuals being purged in North Korea too. The North Korean state had designated Khrushchev as a revisionist, following his criticism of Stalin's cultification. And at the time, the DPRK preferred the Chinese style of communism to that of the Soviet Union. The record of Kim Sang-oh's years in Japan as a student let him down, as it associated him with pro-Japanese collaborators, and was seen as undermining Kim Il-sung's authority as an anti-Japanese resistance fighter. After losing his license as a writer, Kim Sang-oh was banished to the countryside, where for 15 years he worked as a farm laborer. Kim Il-sung, however, had a good memory. When he conducted an on-site guidance session in South Hwanghae Province, he asked for the young speechwriter who had composed Kim's first speech in Hwanghae Province, shortly after the liberation of Korea. Kim Sang-oh was subsequently recalled to Pyongyang, and he composed the lyric poem, My Homeland, at this emotional time, praising the person of Kim Il-sung instead of the state or territory as his true homeland. My classmate, Ri Suryeon, was born in Seohung-gun in Hwanghae province, where Kim Sang-oh had been in exile, but following his rehabilitation, she had moved with him to the capital city of Pyongyang. Kim Il-sung appointed his former speechwriter as the head of UFD Office 101, Section 5. From then on, he had to channel his literary talents to serve the goals of the Workers' Party, working under a pseudonym and deprived of an identity or history of his own. By the time of my visit to his home, he had retired from the UFD, though he was still an honorary director of Office 101 due to his official status as a Kim Il-sung associate. As his UFD title came with no actual responsibility, he was living as quiet and ordinary a life as possible for someone with such a background. More importantly, from my perspective, he also had the time to meet me. When Kim Sang-oh himself opened the door, I was startled and bowed deeply from the waist. His tall stature and imposing countenance made a strong first impression on me, suggesting that men of Kim Il-sung's inner circle were, even in appearance, extraordinary beings. Yet it was his humility that made him a truly great man in my eyes. In spite of his status, Kim Sang-oh's house was cold because of the erratic heating system in Pyongyang. As I entered, his wife offered me one of his coats to keep me warm, and I was surprised to notice 3 cigarette burns on the fabric. Until fairly recently, the electricity supply had not been too bad, but as it was a centrally organized system, even a minor disruption in one area would affect the hot water heating supply for the rest of Pyongyang. The age of the pipes and their tendency to burst frequently was a problem, and many households resorted to siphoning hot water from the traditional Korean underfloor heating system to use for washing. So there was always a lack of heat, and with the inefficiency of the infrastructure, even in the harsh middle of winter, the best heat to be had was a lukewarm floor. This was the case even though Kim Sang-oh lived in a senior party cadre's retirement flat, built in the 1980s, in a residential area set apart from those of ordinary Pyongyang residents. Although this was the first time we had met, he lamented that what he found more unbearable than the cold was the fact that he could not set foot properly on the bare earth. He had been assigned a 12th floor apartment, and, as the lift was always out of order, he was stuck between the earth and the sky. When he started to talk about his home province, I could see that the burn marks on his coat were nothing compared to the scars in his heart. In the early 1980s, the North Korean state had decided that the presence of disabled citizens in Pyongyang was an affront to the beauty of the city, and banished them en masse to the countryside. Kim Sang-oh's only daughter, who had a physical disability, was left behind in Hwanghae province, when the rest of the family was instructed to relocate to Pyongyang. That woman was my friend Suryeon's mother. On the day of my first visit, Kim Sang-oh took great pains to read every line of the poems I'd taken from my jacket pocket. When he had finished reading my attempt at an epic poem, he laughed heartily, saying that he knew I had written in imitation of Byron. To my astonishment, he did not scold me, but was accepting of it. "If you had come to me with something like, 'Oh, my homeland, oh, my party,' I would have refused to talk to you. I enjoyed your personal narrative of love. I can see that you're faithful to your own voice." Kim Sang-oh's words of moral encouragement became the cornerstone of my life as a writer. He taught me that a piece of writing will stubbornly pursue its author and hold him accountable to the end. Look to your conscience. Speak your own truth. That is the only way that you can go beyond what you have been taught and accomplish a literature that truly belongs to you. In Kim Sang-oh's last years, the UFD pleaded with him continually in the hope that he would produce more state literature for them, but he refused to the end, saying that his health didn't allow it. I wonder, though, if his choice to keep silent was the decisive act of Kim Sang-oh's conscience and his truth, after a life spent in loyal obedience to the Workers' Party. With Kim Sang-or's recommendation, I was able to submit my own poems to the selection process for literary works organized by the party's propaganda and agitation department. The best would be offered for the judgment of Kim Jong-il himself, and my compositions made the selection. On 19th of February 1992, the state newspaper, Rodong Sinmun, published an announcement to the effect that a collection of 50 poems, entitled The Songs of a Blessed Generation, had been presented to General Kim Jong-il on his 50th birthday. He had read the book and written the two poets a letter of commendation. Even today, I remember with vivid clarity the look on the face of the party secretary for Pyongyang Art School as he presented Kim Jong-il's letter of appreciation to me, a student of music who had wronged the school by straying from his assigned course of study. He had to do this in front of all the staff and students, and while he had no alternative but to say, "I am so delighted that we had such a jewel in our school," he twisted my ear with such force that I almost cried out loud on stage. It didn't end there. In his letter, Kim Jong-il said that anything I asked of him would be granted, and I took him at his word. The party required a graduate of music to serve the state in a musical capacity for the remainder of his or her working life, but the party made an exception for me and granted me my first choice of career. I was assigned to be the arts writer of the Chosun Central Broadcasting Committee in the Propaganda and Agitation Department. In North Korea, there is only one television channel. Central TV is broadcast from 5 p.m. to 11 p.m. on weekdays and from 10 a.m. on Sundays. In my new role as arts writer, I was responsible for curating North Korean poetry, and I helped with presenting poetry in a format suitable for television. My parents and teachers were shocked at Kim Jong-il's granting of my wish, as was, of course, the party secretary for Pyongyang Art School. It was 1994 when I began my working life. Before my first day at work, I went to see Kim Sang-or's widow, and in the traditional Korean show of reverence, I offered her a deep bow. Kim Sang-or had died in 1992 of tuberculosis in a special ward on the 11th floor of Kim Man-yu Hospital, a state-of-the-art facility. Even his final breath he gave to me. All cadres had to sign an oath of loyalty to Kim Jong-il when they were close to death, swearing that their single-hearted devotion would continue after they died. Poet Kim Sang-or had added the following words to his handwritten will: "I leave behind unfinished works to be completed by my children and my student." His funeral was handled by the United Front Department, as befitted a dignitary of the state. Kim Il-sung also decided that the Homeland Unification Medal, one of North Korea's highest state honors, was to be awarded to Kim Sang-or on the day of his funeral. The Rodong Sinmun duly announced this as an ordinance of the state. It was Kim Sang-or's will that prompted the UFD to recruit me into its ranks, although I had originally applied to be an arts writer. Following a stern complaint from Kim Jong-il that the UFD had ceased to produce works of Kim Sang-or's quality, UFD First Deputy Director Im Tong-ok had personally sought me out for recruitment. The vetting process for a Central Party cadre required at least 6 months of rigorous background checks, but the process was rushed through on orders from above, and my transfer to the UFD happened quickly. There was another problem, though. The party required UFD staff to be graduates of literature or the social sciences, and music just didn't cut it. So I was admitted to the graduate faculty of literature and languages at the University of Kim Il-sung in September 1996, under the pretext of doing my trial period at the UFD. But this wasn't about due process. It was only a means of achieving an end. The 1-year UFD trial period was also replaced by my graduate degree, and I was admitted to the UFD upon graduation. Because of this history, my request to return to my place of birth was about much more than merely revisiting friends and seeing my hometown again. It was really to make a pilgrimage to the place that had brought me to Choiliang and Kim Sang-or, who had taken my hand in theirs to guide me towards my calling. 3. My hometown transformed. Pyongyang Station was so crowded that it was difficult to see along the platform. There seemed to be more passengers who had spent days waiting for a delayed train than people who were there to buy tickets or embark on their journey. And it wasn't just because this was the central railway terminus in the capital city of North Korea. In North Korea, apart from sections of track linking newly constructed stations, or in the development zones, the rest of the country relied on a single-track railway laid during the Japanese occupation of the Korean peninsula during the first half of the 20th century. North Koreans were used to the fact that trains never operated according to a regular timetable. Both Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il stressed that the railway was the nervous system of the nation. But in reality, North Korea was like a person with nerve damage paralyzing one half of the body. Natural disasters were not even a major problem, given the constant physical breakdowns. Problems with the engine or tracks and frequent blackouts. Even when the electricity was actually working, the power was low, and passengers bounced up and down as the carriage hiccuped its way along the track. Sometimes villagers along the line would race the train on their ox carts, laughing as they overtook the passengers in their carriages. Besides, there were higher priorities, as passenger trains must always give way to the ruling Kim special train, for which myriad routes were kept clear for security reasons, only for them to be changed at the last minute. Many freight trains operated several months behind schedule, and the party and military used all kinds of justifications to get Kim Jong-il's ratification to be granted priority track use. While trains that operated under Kim Jong-il's orders, often carrying military goods, traveled across the country's tracks on maximum priority, passenger trains were at the very bottom of the pecking order. Luckily, my hometown was south of Pyongyang, where there was less rail traffic compared to other regions. This was thanks to the nature of Japanese colonial planning, which focused its infrastructure in the northern parts of the country to aid in its mission of using Korea as a foothold for controlling Manchuria to the north. North Korean trade networks were concentrated on these connections, and the southern regions have been left relatively undeveloped. The distance from Pyongyang to my hometown of Sarawon is 63 kilometers, which would take less than an hour by car. But when I arrived at the station, I was told that the start of the journey would be delayed by 3 hours. I didn't mind the wait. I hadn't been back for 10 years and was determined to make the journey by train, so I was full of excited anticipation. To be honest, I was returning home in clouds of glory, as one of the admitted. I had even planned to take with me my special wineglass, into which the general himself had poured wine, and use it to toast friends back home. But my mother sternly refused me permission, saying that such an heirloom should not be removed from the house. So instead, I had filled my rucksack with alcohol and tinned meats. Carrying this bag and waiting in line for my ticket, I stood tall and proud. Queues are the same everywhere in North Korea. There are 3 signs showing the way to lines for cadres, military personnel, and ordinary residents, and at the head of each line, armed soldiers stand guard. Although only in my 20s, I confidently approached the cadres line with my Central Party identification documents, enclosed in a tan leather wallet and embossed with the gold party emblem. People in this queue were also offered a separate waiting room, so there was no tedious standing in line for several hours like the other passengers. On any train, the carriage at the front of the train is reserved exclusively for the use of party cadres, whereas the platform had been teeming with people. Because this was a restricted area, the carriage was empty save for a few people. Near the door, there were 4 people with dark faces, who seemed nervous and kept looking around. It appeared that they had boarded the train illegally by bribing an officer. As if their goal was not Sarawon, but the safe start of the journey, they were so relieved when the train began to move that they bent over and giggled among themselves. In North Korea, there is no freedom of movement. You can only buy a train ticket by showing an official travel pass the size of an identity card, stating your reasons for travel. If you travel without such a pass and are discovered, the sentence is 3 months of hard labor. A security agent soon appeared in the carriage. He must have been offered a bribe too, because he did not ask to see the travel passes of the 4 joyriders. As if in gratitude to me for pretending not to have noticed this, once he had checked my travel pass, he stood to attention and saluted me very formally. For a long time, I couldn't take my eyes off the constantly changing scenery outside the window. We had to wait for over 2 hours at Hwangju Station on the way, but even this did not bother me. I was in enough of a trance to be going back to my hometown, like a pilgrim returning to a pure and holy spring. When the train finally arrived at Sarawon Station, after travelling for over half a day, I leapt excitedly from my seat, but was surprised to see the crowded platform. Having travelled in leisure in an almost empty carriage, I was puzzled to see so many passengers disembarking onto the same platform as me. I even saw dozens of people jumping down from the roof of my carriage. At first, I shook my head at the way they had put themselves at such risk just to get a free ride. But when I approached the commotion further ahead on the platform, I saw that money had not been the problem. Security agents were beating up several passengers and yelling questions. "Answer me! Do you bastards have a travel pass? Fucking answer the question!" There are also security checkpoints on all roads that cross the borders of counties and provinces, even in the hills. Those people who were risking the law anyway by travelling without authorization were forced to travel on the roof of carriages for convenience and ease of escape. This was probably why the people picked on by the security agents betrayed no sign of the strength it must have required to risk their lives by travelling on the roof of a carriage, and instead were pleading with tears and every kind of piteous explanation they could think of. The atmosphere of my hometown was so different from that of Pyongyang. This unfamiliarity destroyed all the calm excitement of my pilgrimage. The yelling, screaming, and coarse swearing all around me made the place feel dark and terrifying. For a while I stood there feeling lost. I looked around at the screeching mob of people who had come to the station to meet the train. They were not here merely to greet family and friends, but to collect their cargo. Most of the passengers had been ferrying large sacks of corn or rice. Until 1994, and the start of the arduous march, all North Koreans relied for sustenance on the Socialist Public Distribution System, PDS, which determined the allocation of every basic necessity of life. This included household items and items of food, whether rice or eggs. The ration size was determined by the state, and it also served as a marker of class in North Korea. The highest ration that was granted, the daily ration, conferred a generous amount of supplies for a household. The Central Party's Finance and Administration Department made sure that every morning a refrigerated Nissan truck delivered fresh supplies to the honored few. The daily ration was granted only to the households of Central Party secretaries, directors, and corps commanders in the military. Further down the hierarchy came 3-day rations, weekly rations, and monthly rations. 3-day rations applied to the households of those who held a rank equivalent to ministers, party secretaries at the city level, and Central Party cadres ranked deputy director. Departmental directors in the Central Party institutions and section chiefs received weekly rations. Those who were admitted to Dear Leader's circle, such as myself, received individual rations on a weekly basis instead of household rations. This included 5 kilos of seafood and meat, 21 kilos of rice, 30 eggs, 2 bottles of cooking oil, and fresh produce. Monthly rations, once allocated to the vast majority of ordinary North Koreans, disappeared with the collapse of the state's PDS in 1994. Weekly rations and the grades above still remain in force, enjoyed only by the loyal and fortunate. But the ration classes that applied to cadres were kept as a secret from the ordinary populace, because they had relied solely on rations and suddenly had to fend for themselves, while cadres were still supplied. At the time, A nationwide campaign of self-sufficiency was promoted in order to urge people to make do on their own, following the example of the general. This meant that the suppression of information about the rations enjoyed by the higher classes was all the more strictly enforced. During the arduous march and these times of economic hardship, the trains diligently transported not only people, but the cargo of self-sufficiency. Observing the weight of their cargo, everything else I saw at the station made me grimace. As I stood there, surprised and somewhat appalled at the chaotic sight before me, someone tapped me on my shoulder. It was my friend, young Nam, who had promised to meet me at the station. His face was clearly marked by the effects of hunger, but his youthful smile was the same as ever. Seeing him was like a fog lifting from my eyes. "You've grown up," I said. Just as I'd done when we were children, I pinched his earlobe instead of shaking hands. His chubby earlobe was larger than anyone else's, and had always reminded me of a mother's swollen nipple. When we were very small, I even pinched it till it bled on a few occasions. "Let's go," he said. The strength he displayed when relieving me of my rucksack reminded me of our childhood playfulness. After leaving the ticket barrier, I looked round near the station entrance. The first thing I noticed was the Sarawon post office opposite, which was unchanged, as if time had stood still since I had left. At the same time, although I had remembered it as a large building, it seemed to have grown smaller and tarnished with age. The concurrence of things being exactly as they had been, but at the same time smaller and more shabby, was the same with the grocery store and food store next to the post office. But the cement of the large station square, which in my memory was smooth, was now full of cracks and wounds. A fresh breeze blew in my face, and I noticed the big elm tree still leaning to one side, as if about to collapse sidelong. Its continued survival cheered me a little. When I was of primary school age, my mother and I had often waited under that tree for my father on his return from a business trip. Vivid memories came rushing back. In one scene, I picked up a broken piece of blue glass from a bottle and used it to reflect the sunlight, which glittered through the branches and leaves in different directions. When we set off to the right of the station square, I wondered if we had taken a wrong turn. This was not the park I remembered, covered with vibrant foliage. There was no sign of the deer or pheasants that used to roam here. Instead of a single pavement running straight through the park, there were many dirt tracks leading in confusing directions. On either side of this tangled road, long lines of squatting hawkers in shabby, worn clothes, old and young, male and female, tempted travellers with their trinkets. Young Nam urged me on, but I did not want to miss anything. I deliberately paced myself in order to browse the hawkers' wares spread out on either side of me. I grimaced as I took in every sort of poverty known to North Korea's provinces, gathered together and put on display here in this miserable plot. The stench of unwashed bodies in the air was rank. The wares optimistically placed on display by grimy hands were not the kind one would expect to pay for. I asked one woman why she was selling an empty insulated flask for 21. She replied by saying that if I filled it with hot water, I could hug it during the night to keep warm. It also bewildered me to see tap water on sale. It cost 10 won to wash your face with soap and water, and 5 to wash with water alone. Young Nam told me, as if it was an everyday occurrence, that face washing was a service that had been introduced the previous year. Not only had there been famine here, but the water supply had also dried up. Although the women were shouting, "Water for your face!" their own faces were greasy and dirt-flecked. It was disheartening to see the state of these women reduced to selling tap water, and women with no water of their own forced to sell off their most precious possessions. When I discovered that the cotton comforters on sale had been stuffed with filters collected from old cigarette butts, I could not suppress a snort of disgust. A woman sat by her wares, concentrating on the task. How many old cigarette butts did it take to fill a comforter? Was this the best they could do? People should not have to live like this. They weren't living a life, but living in order to stay alive, themselves discarded like used cigarette butts. But, as if anticipating my condescension, the old woman swore at me, shouting that those who did not collect old cigarette butts deserved to die. "Don't you think of looking down on me," she added, with a strange air of dignity. Turning towards the far corners of the park, I could see a swarm of homeless people who looked to be either dead or dying. There was nothing between these men and women in a cold grave but their own shadows, and even those who were still alive were clearly waiting for death. There were also men hovering over the bodies like flies, at times poking at the inert figures with a stick. I asked Young Nam what they were doing. My Japo friend explained, scratching too audibly at his skin through his clothes. "They're from the Corpse Division," he said, "dispatched by the city's party committee." "Corpse Division? What do you mean?" "Why, they get rid of the corpses. Maybe you don't have this in Pyongyang, but the committees in all the other provinces dispatch them to their main park near the station. All sorts of people move through the station, so they come here to beg until they die." Young Nam's expression, so unmoved even in the face of death, was distant and unfamiliar. A corpse division? Such a thing could never exist in Pyongyang, which was a holy center of revolution and the capital of Chosun. Although North Korea's official name is the Democratic People's Republic of Chosun, in reality it was and remains a Republic of Pyongyang residents. When there was famine all over the country and rations stopped, supplies were rerouted to Pyongyang residents as the first priority. The issuing of travel passes was severely restricted, and security at the Pyongyang border controls was heightened, so that supplies routed to the capital could not seep into other provinces. From 1996, when even Pyongyang rations broke down, the party finally resorted to an opening of trade with the Chinese so that flour and corn could be brought in. Even when Pyongyang residents did starve or freeze to death, they couldn't be left on the streets as in the provinces. Pyongyang was the showcase of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il's North Korea for foreign visitors, and its appearance had to be kept up at all costs. Young Nam continued, "Apparently the party secretary for Ham-hung thought of the idea and received a state medal for it. Good for him. The dead are beyond gratitude, but the living are appreciative. How else would we get rid of all the corpses? You get a full day's ration if you sign up for the work. That's quite generous, you know." As my friend chattered on, he seemed to be speaking in a different language from the one used in Pyongyang. Nothing here seemed familiar to me any longer. I stood watching the Corpse Division at work, ignoring Young Nam's wave of the hand urging me to move on. The Corpse Division had a loaded rickshaw, on top of which some empty sacks were laid. 6 bare and skeletal feet poked out from beneath these, in oddly assorted directions. For the first split second, I did not understand what I was seeing, but as soon as I realized these empty sacks were human bodies, I grew nauseous and wretched. I trembled with angry regret for having looked too closely. I had heard rumors that when the public distribution system collapsed, corpses could be seen on the streets in some provinces, but I had never thought to see it happen in my own hometown. The place I cherished in my memory had been like a beautiful landscape painting. Now that was sullied forever and torn into shreds. At this portrayal of my memories, I felt rage tempered by confusion rising up from deep within me. As I met the townspeople and my old neighbors, I became ever more despondent. After I'd finished unpacking at Young Nam's house and had changed my clothes, neighbors swarmed into the house. Young Nam's mother had knocked on everyone's door to say that the doctor's son had come back to visit. They put everything on hold to come and marvel at me, one of the admitted. Without exception, everyone I saw looked old and exhausted. "We heard you had dinner with the general. What kind of porridge does he like to eat?" It was Mr. Tallman Park, who used to live down the street from us. He had eaten nothing but porridge since the last state holiday. His face was jaundiced. "The General? Oh, you know the song. The rice balls of the General. Just like in the song. He shared a rice ball with us," I mumbled in response. Even though these were simple country folk who believed whatever the Workers' Party told them, I could not have imagined that I would be asked this question so soon. I rubbed my hands, sticky with sweat, but the townspeople seemed relieved to hear that the General dined on solid rice balls instead of porridge. Some tutted, while others stood in mute wonder. I heard a voice saying that it was just as the party cadres had told them. So we had to do more for the patriotic rice movement, even if it meant forking out money for the rice. The patriotic rice movement was a campaign whereby ordinary North Koreans offered their rice to the state as an act of patriotism. The townspeople continued to quiz me endlessly about the General, asking anxiously after his health. I was appalled by the fact that they were concerned more for their leader's well-being than for their own, although they were in a wretched state. I did my best to answer their questions with lies, but found myself disgusted by the man I had become. The life had been drained out of my townsfolk, and there was no comfort from seeing any of their faces again. When I met Sun-young from next door, I used to have a crush on her, and she was always my playwife in our childhood games of marriage. She had become a disfigured old woman. As soon as our eyes met, she withdrew her gaze and hung her head, revealing her thin, bare neck, another sign of her impoverished state. Jong-il, once famous for his strength and envied by all the other boys in town, had turned into nothing but skin and bones. Their prematurely darkened, cadaverous skin, and the deep zigzagging wrinkles on their faces were a silent testament to the years of starvation they had endured. When I asked after some neighbors I could not see in the crowd, the matter-of-fact reply was that each one of them had starved to death. The shock of it felt like a blow to the head. In my memories, these names belonged to those who were alive and well, but they didn't exist on this planet anymore. I mourned the hollowness inside me. Suddenly, I heard someone yelling outside. Mr. Tallman Park told me that it was Grandfather Appletree Cottage. He had gone mad. Everyone in our town knew about Appletree Cottage. The house was so called because the grandfather planted an apple tree in their yard when his granddaughter was born, so that they could grow up together. Every autumn, the town's children would come round and ask, "When can we pick the apples?" Grandfather Appletree Cottage would answer, "Come along this Sunday with your mum and dad. Don't forget, Sunday is apple-picking day." Appletree Cottage had always been welcoming to us. I asked why Grandfather Appletree Cottage had become deranged. Jong-il answered with a deep sigh. "There's no more apple tree. Grandfather chopped it down after his granddaughter hanged herself from it. Her mother left home to be with some son of a bitch, and her father died a few years ago. The mother never kept in touch, so there was only her grandfather left. He looked after her. How could an adolescent girl fend for herself? But one night, a thief came and picked all their apples. The next morning, the grandfather found that his granddaughter had hanged herself from the apple tree. He went raving mad after that. Says he will eat the thief when he is found." The story was already wretched beyond belief, but when Jong-il finished by saying that everyone still called the old man Grandfather Appletree Cottage, although there was no more apple tree, I could no longer keep my composure, and tears welled from my eyes. I pretended to wipe some dirt off with the back of my hand. I felt deeply sorry that I was hiding my own tears from them, but I was too ashamed of myself to show them my tears. How could I, with my privileged existence, express my misery in front of those who had nothing left, who had been deprived even of the means to express their misery? With these thoughts, I was overcome by an impulse to hide my hands, and sat down. The lives of my townsfolk were threatened by their not having enough to eat, and it was mortifying that my hands had been employed for literature when the nation was in such a state. Or rather, I needed desperately to hide my hands from my old neighbors, My very hands seemed to me to embody my arrogance and selfishness, and their soft skin to expose how I had used them to secure my own existence at the expense of countless other lives. That night, at the dinner prepared by Young Nam's mother, I had to choke back my tears again. She proudly explained how she was able to offer me, her guest, a half-full bowl of rice. She had stashed away 10 grains of rice at every meal. In addition to the rice, there was a small dish of salted cabbage and pickled anchovies, which were presented to me as if they were an expensive delicacy. When I asked how long it had taken to save up the rice, she replied, 3 months. I could not believe that they were eating rice by the grain, instead of in servings. I muttered an excuse, saying that I had indigestion after eating lunch on the train. Almost as soon as I left the table, Young Nam's father scolded his wife severely, saying that she had put me off my food. He brought me my spoon, forcing me to grip it, and pleading with me to join them at the table again. From my rucksack, I took out my imported liquor and tinned meats, the ones I had brought with me from Pyongyang as parting gifts. "Look, don't worry about me. I'm not refusing because there's not enough food," I blurted. Although I had brought these food items as gifts, I was at my wits' end when it came to explaining my possession of such extravagant luxuries to a family who ate rice by the grain. When Young Nam's father lifted the bottle of cognac and marveled in wonder, I felt even more overwhelmed by a sense of foreboding. "Ah, I haven't seen Western liquor for years," he sighed. "You know, when we first arrived in North Korea from Japan, I had so many of the bottles that I gave them out as gifts whenever I could." The mother, suddenly embarrassed by her own meager offering in comparison to the gifts I had brought with me, sheepishly nudged the bowl of rice towards her husband. "You have the rice," she said. "Perhaps I should have saved it for another time." The bowl of rice was passed to the son by the father, then by the son back to the mother. Young Nam's mother eventually took it back into the kitchen to keep it for her daughter, who had gone out to work a night shift at the fabric factory. My chest felt tight, but I was also moved by the love that led this family, with so little rice of their own, to offer the last of it to an outsider. Young Nam's father continued to gaze in wonder at the bottle of imported liquor I had bought. When I told him that it was given to me by dear leader, his mouth dropped. Kim Jong-il gave special gifts to his senior cadres 3 times a year, on New Year's Day, Kim Il-sung's birthday, and his own birthday. These might include suit fabric from Italy, rare medicinal herbs or shoes, all especially imported. But while other items might change, the liquor was always a key feature. The custom of imported liquor gifts was instituted because many cadres, previously unfamiliar with these drinks, had been mesmerized by them, drinking excessively at state banquets or during foreign postings, and committing social gaffes. Generally speaking, the alcoholic gift pack consisted of 2 bottles each of 3 types of cognac, 6 bottles in all. For a North Korean cadre, the gift of imported liquor was effectively the gift of foreign currency, as each bottle sold easily for around $100 on the black market. But anything sold on to traders on the black market eventually wound its way back into cadres' hands as bribes, so the gift of cognac was worth much more than its face value. This was also the reason why prices of imported liquor in North Korea plummet around the time of the 3 state holidays mentioned. Young Nam's father seemed interested in more than merely drinking the contents of the bottle. He was transfixed by the foreign label, and perhaps wanted the bottle as a keepsake. He asked outright if I would give it to him as a present. When I said yes, he rushed to find himself an empty glass and filled it with the cognac, as if to get rid of the drink as quickly as he could. Young Nam's Osakan father savoured his cognac, explaining that it reminded him of his past. But after draining 2 glasses, he lost control. "You know that Yamaha piano you had at home? I gave that to your family. You know that, right? And our house, you know your father gave me this. You know that too, right? Yes, yes. I could do nothing but respond monosyllabically, and I could feel the blood surging to my head. I'm forever designated a Japo, so I've never been allowed to have a real job. You know, around this time last year, your father came to sleep over at our place. We hadn't eaten for days. I was hungry. I was so hungry that I contacted your father. You know, I realized that a friend is better than the homeland. It's thanks to your father's support that we were able to survive for 1 more year. I made him promise not to tell you. Young Nam's mother tried to calm him down. You're drunk. Stop talking about the homeland in that way in front of the kids. Besides, we decided to move to North Korea at your bidding. What good is it to regret the decision now? Behind her words, there lay many other words that could not be said. Yes, I'm sorry, her husband replied. I'm sorry for bringing us to this country, but tonight, I'm a happy man. With you here, it feels like we've had ourselves a proper meal. Do you have any idea what we've been doing for food? You know, this wife of mine, she puts rice water on the table and calls it rice. She boils wild shoots and serves the liquid broth as if it's a proper stew. There's never any real food on the table, but she still demands we sit at the table for our meal. And why not? We can pretend we've eaten proper food and feel better about our lives. Young Nam sat with his head in his hands, glaring at his father from between his fingers, as if thinking that his father was ruining the last remaining shreds of dignity in their lives. When I noticed the signs of starvation on the crown of his head, it rent my heart. Young Nam, I didn't know. Forgive me for my ignorance. The next morning I packed my bags to leave. I had planned to stay for 2 more days, but made up an excuse, saying I was needed urgently at work. When I saw the tattered shoes that young Nam put on as he hurriedly followed me out of the house, I was glad I had made the decision to leave. Wanting to buy him a new pair of shoes before I went back to Pyongyang, I said we should go by the market. As we walked, I stole a glance at his dangling earlobe. It had dry white patches of flaky skin, which spread down to his neck. I felt bitterly sorry for all the times I had pinched him as a child. So, how does it feel to be back home? Is it much different from Pyongyang? His voice was feeble, and sounded as if it was coming from afar. People live the same anywhere you go. I even get told off at work all the time. I want to move to Pyongyang. At least you can get a job there. Even meet the general, like you did. I faltered, searching for words that might comfort him. Just walking alongside him was mortifying, and I felt guilty that my visit had thrown his life into disarray. But he started to pour his heart out. You don't get it, do you? There's no future for me. At least you're in Pyongyang, where you can get on in life by working hard. You even got to choose your own career. Here, scrambling for the next meal is the best I can do. Even if I make it today, there's the next meal to worry about. And the next. All my waking hours are spent fearing whether I will be able to eat again. We live no better than animals. You saw with your own eyes at the station. You know how the standard greeting used to be, "Have you eaten?" But now you can't say that, because what can you say in response? No, I haven't, and what the fuck can you do about it? Can't you see? It's different outside Pyongyang. And you don't have those in the capital city either, do you? I looked to where he was pointing. The walls on either side of the marketplace entrance were plastered with black-lettered slogans, instead of the usual prices of goods. Death by firing squad to those who disobey traffic rules. Death by firing squad to those who hoard food. Death by firing squad to those who waste electricity. Death by firing squad to those who cut military communications lines. Death by firing squad to those who hoard state resources. Death by firing squad to those who spread foreign culture. Death by firing squad to those who gossip. I hadn't realized that there had been so many new regulations introduced in our nation. The slogans implied that any and every mistake would lead to death by firing squad. In Pyongyang, to avoid the eyes and ears of foreigners and tourists, new regulations were announced internally, through workplace and residential unit meetings that all North Koreans are required to attend. I realized I had never before seen a regulation posted in a publicly visible place. It took me a while to remember why we had come to the market in the first place. Once I'd regained my composure, I wanted to buy the shoes as quickly as possible and get out of this place, and so I took the lead, holding Youngnam by the hand. There were more people hanging around than were actually buying or selling. As we made our way through the crowds, the stench was suffocating. "Take care with your wallet," Youngnam warned me. I walked even faster, and finally found a shoe stall. I asked Youngnam to pick a pair of shoes he liked. He resisted, saying he was sorry enough not to be able to treat me well as a guest, and he couldn't possibly receive a gift on top of that. As he reluctantly picked out a cheap pair, I asked the vendor for the most expensive pair he had. Even that turned out to be of mediocre quality, a pair made in China. Youngnam recalled a Korean saying, "They say that if you buy shoes as a parting gift, you'll never see each other again." "You think I'm your lover or something? What do you mean, never see each other again?" I said. Seeing the grin spread ear to ear on Youngnam's face, I felt a little better. After the purchase was made, I forced the change and the rest of the money in my wallet into Youngnam's pocket. But before we were able to leave, a siren started somewhere. "What's that?" I asked. The reaction of the people around us was even stranger than the sound of the siren. Everyone looked annoyed, and some swore loudly. Youngnam's eyes were closed. He too looked exasperated. Then he hissed, "Fucking hell!" When I asked again what was happening, he said it was an execution. "What?" I asked. The shoe vendor looked up from polishing a shoe with a tattered rag, and replied in Youngnam's place, "You're not from here, are you? Bad timing, that's all. There's going to be a people's trial. No one can leave the market till it's over." In North Korea, a public execution is not regarded as a punishment. It is categorized as a method of moral education, and also as a tool of public propaganda used in power struggles. But an execution in the market? As I looked confusedly at Youngnam, he reassured me that these executions took place almost on a weekly basis. They always happened in the market square, so that a large audience could watch the proceedings. Sure enough, soldiers rushed in from all directions to surround the square, herding us into the center with the butts of their rifles. There was chaos everywhere. It made me flinch that the prisoner, led in by two soldiers, was dressed not in prison uniform, but in everyday clothes. It felt like a deliberate message to the townsfolk that any of them could be in his position, that it didn't take a special criminal mind to suffer this fate. The man's eyes were full of terror as he scanned the scene around him from beneath his sagging eyelids and bony sockets. There was blood around his lips. For him, this truly was hell on earth, and his fellow men must have seemed as frightening as demons. The people's trial was over in less than 5 minutes. It was not really a trial. A military officer merely read out his judgment. The prisoner's crime was declared to be the theft of 1 sack of rice. As the country was ruled according to the Song-un policy of military-first politics, all the rice in the nation belonged to the military, and even petty crimes were dealt with according to martial law. "Death by firing squad!" As soon as the judge pronounced his sentence, one of the 2 soldiers who was restraining the prisoner shoved something into his mouth, in a swift, practiced motion. It was a V-shaped spring that expanded once it was put inside the mouth, preventing the prisoner from speaking intelligibly. The prisoner made sounds, but there was no human noise, only whimpering. This device had been officially sanctioned for use at public executions, so that a prisoner could not utter rebellious sentiments in the final moments of his life before it was taken from him. Bang, bang, bang! I had never been so close to a gun being fired. The blood froze in my veins. Not daring to look at the prisoner at the moment of his death, I flicked my gaze upward. There was not a cloud in the sky, which was exceedingly clear and bright blue, but the faces of the townsfolk made to witness the execution were grave. When the soldiers blew their whistles and yelled for the crowd to disperse, the people didn't react and began murmuring among themselves. As the whispers spread, I could catch what was being said. The prisoner's identity had been established by those who knew him, and the shock I felt after learning the story is hard to describe. My hair stood on end, and a tingling chill reached from there to the ends of my toes. The prisoner. Wherever people are gathered, there are gunshots to follow. Today, as the crowd looks on, another man is condemned. We must not feel any sympathy. Even when he's dead, we must kill him again. The slogan is interrupted. Bang, bang, as the rest of the message is delivered. Why is it that today the crowd is silent? The prisoner's crime? Theft of 1 sack of rice. His sentence? 90 bullets to the heart. His occupation? Farmer. The man riddled with bullets for stealing rice had been a starving farmer. Even someone who worked the land could not find enough to eat.